of webinars that the Down Syndrome Association of Minnesota will be hosting. We actually were delighted. We had received a grant from Dakota County here in Minnesota to actually sponsor these 4 webinars. We are going to be doing a webinar in October on the multicultural challenges of Down syndrome and autism. In November, we'll be doing a webinar on the medical concerns associated with Down syndrome and autism. And in December, we're going to be doing a webinar on designing educational programs for those with Down syndrome and autism. You will, if you've attended this webinar, we'll be sending you a notice specifically reminding you as we firm up those dates with the next 3 speakers. Otherwise, look for information from Dina at DS-ASD, and there will be information on our website. We have a lot to cover today, so I'm going to just introduce Sam, and then we'll turn it over to him. So Sam Towers is the owner of Towers Behavioral Services. He's a behavioral analyst who's spent 25 years providing services to individuals with disabilities who exhibit problem behavior. In addition, he's served as a special educator and he's trained special education teachers at the University of Kentucky. Sam has a master's degree in special education from the University of Northern Colorado, and he's completed 3 years of postmaster's training at the University of Kentucky. And in addition, if you own the book, When Down Syndrome and Autism Intersect, Sam is the author of the chapter Addressing Problem Behaviors in Individuals with Down Syndrome and Autism. Sam, we're going to turn the floor over to you now.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm excited that there's so many of you out there. Thank you. I hope I make this worth your time. So, this is about addressing problem behavior in individuals with Down syndrome and autism spectrum disorders. We're going to start out by talking about building rapport. I'm talking about building rapport first because it is the essential, it is the foundation upon which all interventions, whether they be behavioral or academic, are placed. So when we look at this screen, I want you to take a look at your handouts. Hopefully you've printed out your handouts. And on the second page of the handouts, you should see at the top that it says, what is rapport? And then see the sentence that's on the screen now. Rapport is a positive relationship between 2 people. That word positive is underlined. If you notice in your handouts, there's a blank there. That's a place for you to write in positive. So I've provided these handouts so that you won't have to take notes, or at least not nearly as many notes as you would, but I've left out keywords here and there that you need to write in to have those complete notes, and I've done that to help keep you as actively engaged learners. Again, we'll have time for questions at the end of the webinar. So, yeah, rapport is a positive relationship between 2 people. It's when 2 people feel good about each other and enjoy each other. You will be a great deal, and I can't understate this or overstate it, I guess. You will be a great deal more effective if you have well-developed rapport with the individual. After all, think about it. As we go on with our daily lives and activities, whether it be at home, at work, in our neighborhoods, the community, we all will give more and do more for those that we have a positive relationship with, for those people that we enjoy. So, next, rapport is the foundation upon which all effective interventions are built. And it is truly the foundation. If you don't have a good solid foundation under a house, you're going to have problems, and your house isn't going to work the way you want it to. Up to and including, I would suspect, the house falling down. Same thing when you're working with individuals with Down syndrome and autism spectrum disorders, or really with anyone. So it's very key that you establish rapport with the individual first. To build rapport, we use pairing, and it means you associate or pair yourself repeatedly, lots of times, with a wide variety of activities, people, and things that are pleasurable or fun for the person. Let's see how, let's talk about one example of how this happens in our real lives. Let's take a baby, brand new born baby. Now, that baby, the birth mother will be able to build rapport with it, build that strong mother-child relationship. And by the way, for you fathers listening, fathers do the same thing too, but I'll use the mother as an example. But let's say that baby is taken at birth and given to an adoptive mother. That adoptive mother and that baby will be able to build as strong a relationship. The rapport will be just as strong as with the bio mother. So what is it about a mother, whether she is the birth mother or an adoptive mother, what is it that the mother does to build that positive relationship with the child? Well, let's look back at the screen. She associates or pairs herself repeatedly with a wide variety of activities, people, and things that are pleasurable. She does things like she feeds the child. Well, that's very pleasurable for the child. She takes care of problems. Let's say there's a wet diaper, the child is uncomfortable and crying. The mother comes over, changes the diaper, and fixes the problem. The problem, or the baby, or the mother will also pick up a baby, cuddle the baby, hug it, rock him back and forth, etc. And for the vast majority of children, that is a very pleasurable experience too. Not for every child with autism, but it is very pleasurable. So this mother, whether she's the birth mother or the adoptive mother, just pairs herself with many, many different things that the baby enjoys. And after a little while, the baby thinks to itself, well, not in these words, but, wow, this person's pretty cool. I like her. Yeah. So that's what we have to do. We have to do things with the individuals we're serving with DS-ASD in order to build that relationship. In order to use pairing, you're going to need to know what the individual enjoys. In my field, we call those reinforcers. But do they like lots of attention? Do they like certain foods? Do they like certain activities? What is it that they like? We will need to know those things and pair ourselves with that immediately. Every child with whom I have worked, whether as a teacher or a behavior analyst, the very first order of business has been to establish a positive relationship with that child. Okay, let's go on. Now, the following is a quote that comes from Communication-Based Intervention for Problem Behavior, a User's Guide for Producing Positive Change. Ted Carr is the first author. This is an excellent, excellent book on both how to assess behavior, that's the first 6 chapters, and then chapters 7 through 13, I believe it is about intervening. This is one of those very rare books that is research-based, but layperson friendly. And I would recommend that if you have any interest at all in this, that you get a copy of this, and if you work in an organization, that the organization have at least one copy that can be provided on a checkout basis or whatever to the folks who work in that organization. So here's the quote. The idea is for you and the individual displaying behavior problems to interact with one another within a context of sharing entertaining and rewarding activities and generally enjoying each other's company. These interactions may strike you or others as goofing off, but that is not a problem as long as it leads to an ongoing positive relationship. Ultimately, rapport building is intended to establish a friendship between you and the person with disabilities, a friendship that can provide a basis for teaching that person that there are other ways besides problem behavior for achieving important goals. That last sentence is very important too. that there are other ways besides problem behavior to achieve the goals that the person has. We're going to talk about that later when we talk about replacement behaviors. So again, it might look like goofing off, but that's all right. However, we can't spend all of our time in our relationship with that individual goofing off. We do have to move on, but you continue to need to build rapport so that you can maintain it over time with that individual. Building rapport is not something that is once done and forgotten. You have to build and maintain that rapport. So, one way to do it is your positive interactions with an individual should outnumber the negative 10 to 1 or more. Don't we all enjoy people who are praising us, having good times with us, more than we do grumpy people? Most certainly. That ratio should be 10 to 1. Now, in some situations, for periods of time, you might not be able to keep up that 10 to 1 ratio. Say in a very challenging situation where the person is using some extreme problem behavior or verbal behavior, you might have to be directive quite a bit of the time. That's why before and after that you front load and back load with the positive interactions. Examples of positive interactions include praise. You know, most people enjoy praise. And smiling at the individual. Many people enjoy having other people smile at them. Now again, there are some people who have autism, whether they have Down syndrome or not, who might not fully appreciate praise or having people smiling at them, but there are other things you can pair yourself with. And then engaging in activities with the individual that the individual enjoys, whether that be playing a little game, or if push comes to shove, I will provide small bites of healthy food that the person enjoys just to help start building the relationship. Another thing you can do, and this will help with your 10 to 1 ratio, is frequently catch the individual doing well. Catching a person doing well is purposefully looking for things the person is doing well and praising the person for it. One trick, you know, sometimes it's hard, you know, especially for people who are working in group homes, in classrooms, etc., where there are a lot of individuals that you're looking after. It can, and you're very busy, it can be hard to remember to catch people doing well. I have a little trick for you. Take a bunch of marbles, 20 or 30 marbles, and put them in one of your front pockets, pants pockets if you have them, and you will not be used to having those pockets there, so every time you notice this big, bulky pocket full of marbles, that should serve as a prompt to you to look around and catch the individual or individuals doing well and praise them for it. And when you do that, take a marble out of that pocket and put it into the other pocket so that you can track your own behavior on catching people doing well. And by the time you get used to having this big, bulky pocket full of marbles and you don't notice it anymore, you should be well into the habit of looking around and catching other people doing well. This process of catching a person doing well helps a person to feel better about himself or herself, increases the likelihood that the person will continue to do things at which you catch them doing well. And really what that is we're hopefully the effect is that we're reinforcing the behavior. We're encouraging the person to do the behavior again. So if we praise the person for picking up the dishes and taking them into the kitchen, if praise is meaningful to that person, it's likely that they will do it again. And this often decreases the likelihood of problem behavior and builds rapport. By the way, the decreasing the likelihood of problem behavior in and of itself, catching an individual doing well and using that 10-to-1 ratio often decreases the likelihood of the problem behavior, because the individual is coming to find you as someone they enjoy, and for many individuals that means they don't want to disappoint you, at least no more often than they have to. Okay, so it can lead in and of itself to a decrease in problem behavior. Now, I'm going to talk here with you about non-request interactions. Your non-request interactions, meaning where you're just talking with a person, you're not asking them to do something with an individual, should outnumber the request interactions 10-to-1 or more. Let's think about this. Probably all of us have known one or more people who in our lives, when we see them coming, we know they're going to ask us to do something. It might be a neighbor coming over to borrow a tool. It might be a friend coming over to borrow your computer, whatever. It seems like the only time they show up is when they need something from you. Well, at those times, you and I might look like for a closet that we can lock ourselves in and hide from the person. But our folks with disabilities do not have usually a closet to which they can hide, but they can build a wall between themselves and you. Even though you may be standing 2 or 3 feet apart from each other, there's a wall between you if you don't have that rapport built. And especially if all you're doing is asking them to do something, because they're thinking, gosh, what's he want me to do this time? Another one, always be kind. You know, we all like kind people better than grumpy people. So always, always approach people with being kind. Kind and gentle are the bywords in this field and really in all life and all interactions. Now, that doesn't mean that you can be directive and that you can be firm. You most certainly can be directive and firm, but you can do it in a kind and gentle way. So how do you know if you've built rapport? You will know that you've built rapport if the person approaches you. Yeah, if someone comes to you, that's generally a good sign that they enjoy you. However, I have to give you an example that I saw in my work once. I was working in a home with a family, mother, 2 kids, and then a live-in partner, her pseudo-husband. And the live-in partner, this man, only interacted with the children if he wanted something from them. He wanted to ask them to do something for him, give him something or whatever. He did not sit down and talk with them about how their day had been, you know, if they were enjoying themselves, nothing. And the only time the children interacted with him was to ask him for something for which he had control. It was a very, very limited relationship. So they only approached each other to ask each other for things. Well, very sadly, the mother was killed in a car accident, and the children were then put in the custody of the Department of Human Services, and this gentleman petitioned to be able to adopt the children. And I am certain it's because of the money that was to come with the children. I testified in court as to what I'd seen about these interactions, and the children won. They were not adopted by him, they were adopted by someone else. But if a person approaches you just to visit with you, that's a good sign. If they smile at you, excuse me, that's also a good sign that you've built rapport. And otherwise seem to enjoy your presence, smiling and laughing. You know that you are starting to build rapport when you have seen these things. Okay, next section. Why do people use problem behavior? In this section, we're going to talk a little bit about how your interactions might unintentionally lead a person with DS-AD to use problem behavior. And the sort of interactions you can use so as not to encourage problem behavior. People use problem behavior because it results in a payoff for them. They get something from that behavior. That payoff in the behavior field is known as reinforcement. Reinforcement just means that it increases the likelihood that the person will use the behavior again. And then, as you see below, actually people use good behavior for a payoff. Reinforcement also. I'm hoping that the payoff for you all for attending this webinar is that you hope to come away with knowledge that will help you in serving people with DS-ASD and truly other individuals with disabilities and without. So this means that all behavior has a purpose. In other words, the person is trying to accomplish some sort of goal. They're trying to get a payoff. They're trying to get some sort of reinforcement. Now, I've just told you a little white lie. Not all behavior has a purpose, but almost, well over 99.99, one instance of behavior that does not have a purpose is Parkinson's, the shaking and trembling that goes on. I'm sure there's no purpose behind that, and that the people who have it and are trembling wish that they did not tremble and shake. Now, a little sidestep here for a second is often problem behavior can be viewed as a skill deficit, meaning the person with DS-ASD uses a problem behavior to achieve a goal because they don't know a more socially appropriate behavior to achieve it. What that means is we need to teach them the behaviors or the skills to be able to accomplish what they want without using the problem behavior. Now, there are instances where a person with DS-ASD will use behavior when they already know a more socially acceptable behavior to get it. But the most common reason they use problem behavior is that it pays off more frequently. They get the reinforcement more frequently than if they use the appropriate behavior. So that means when we teach them a new behavior, like a replacement behavior that we'll be talking about in a little bit, we need to make sure that that replacement behavior, the new skill we've taught them to use instead of a problem behavior, pays off real reliably. And we will talk about that a little later. Sometimes problem behavior people will use problem behavior even though they know a socially appropriate way because it pays off more immediately. I mean, a lot of individuals with DS-ASD and a lot of people, other people, you know, they want it now. So those are a couple of situations in which they will use a problem behavior when they actually already know an appropriate one. This means we need to teach them the skills to be able to achieve the goals without using problem behavior. So here is one example. A child is in a crowded and noisy place, which is a situation he does not like. You know, lots of people with DS-ASD do not like crowded and do not like noisy. He begins to bite his hand, and his father takes him out of the crowded, noisy place immediately. In this situation, the child got a payoff, was reinforced for biting himself. In other words, the next time that he is in a place that he does not like, he may bite himself again. Now, let me point out here, the father's reaction in this situation isn't a problem when he does it for the first time. He's being kind and supportive. However, that child should be taught to ask to leave such a place, a crowded, noisy place, or another place that he doesn't like, until he learns the skill. He shouldn't be put in those situations again. And this is really most common, most effective, and you'll read this in Ted Carr's book, if we introduce them them to, or have them practice a skill in a situation first that doesn't have any crowds or noisiness, and then we introduce them to a situation where there are few people and there's a little noise, and we prompt them to ask to leave. And when they're good at that, then we introduce them to a situation which has a few more people and a little more noise, and when they're good at asking in that situation, we increase the people and the noise, etc., until they are able to do this skill in a situation that would be difficult for them and highly distracting, but they've had lots of opportunities to practice the skill in less difficult situations. A child with limited communication skills sees some potato chips and begins to hit her mother. So the mother gives the kid the potato chips. In this situation, the child got a payoff. He was reinforced for hitting her, or she was reinforced for hitting her mother. In other words, the next time she wants something, she just might hit again because the behavior worked for her before. And she's going, ah, I see how this world works. I hit and I get what I want. Well, now there's no excuse really for the mother this time, or it's, well, yeah, there is an excuse for the mother for doing this, at least the first time, if she doesn't know that what she's doing is teaching her child to hit to get what she wants. Okay, in this situation, the child should be taught to ask for potato chips. A person puts a string in front of his eyes and flips the string back and forth, watching it as he does so. He doesn't look around to see if anyone is watching. No one comes to him and asks him to stop or asks him what he's doing. No one comes to him and redirects him. No one provides any interaction with him at all. There's no payoff for this behavior from other people. So in this situation, the person got a payoff, was reinforced for watching the string because he likes string waving back and forth. And my guess is that many of you have seen people who have used what we call self-stimulatory behaviors, or in my field, we call them behaviors that are a product of automatic reinforcement, which means the reinforcement or the payoff comes automatically with using the behavior. So sometimes people will wave strings back and forth in front of their eyes and watch them. Sometimes they'll watch a fan going around. Sometimes they'll flush the toilet, watch the water go down, flush the toilet, watch the water go down, flush the toilet, watch the water go down, etc., etc. The payoff is not coming from other people. It's coming as a result of the behavior itself. So, the last sentence on this page says, in other situations where he finds nothing interesting happening, or at least nothing that is interesting to him, he may wave the string in front of his eyes again. It's a form of self-entertainment. We often call this stimming instead of self-stimulatory stimming. And by the way, I should let you know that we all stim in one way or another. I'll give you an example. For those of you who love chocolate, this story is for you. Those of you who don't love chocolate, I think you can imagine what's going on. Okay, for those of you who love chocolate, you don't need anyone there praising you, saying, good job chocolate eating, or even paying you to eat the chocolate. Would be nice. I mean, it'd be an ideal job, but you don't need that. In fact, you would eat chocolate all alone. That's the hallmark of a self-stimulatory behavior, is when you use the behavior all alone. You don't need any sort of consequences or payoff or reinforcement from anyone else. Okay, let me go back to that. In my value system, for a person who is self-stimulating, whether it be with a string or a fan or a toilet or whatever it is the person does, this person should be taught other ways to entertain themselves that are more normalized and will not make them stand out. our folks with DS-ASD are already, unfortunately, marginalized. There are a lot of people who don't want to interact with them because they act quote-unquote weird. Well, it's not weird to me. It's atypical behavior. But if we can get them to use behaviors that are more mainstream, they will have more interactions with other people, which will lead directly to a fuller and richer life for them. So again, they should be taught other ways. Not to say that we're going to take away the string or whatever. Some people use that as self-stimulatory behaviors for calming. But we're going to work so that they have other things they can entertain themselves with and not waving the string and flushing the toilet all the time. Okay, a child is asked to do a task at school and she begins to bang her head on the desk. The teacher then tells her, "You don't have to do this. No, never mind," and takes the work away. Well, in this situation, the child got a payoff or was reinforced for banging her head against the desk. She doesn't have to do the task. She escaped something unpleasant, and that can be a really big payoff for people depending upon whatever it is that they want to escape. In other words, the next time that she is asked to do something she doesn't want to do, she just might bang her head on something again, whether it be a desk or a floor or a wall or whatever. Okay, in this situation, this child should be taught to ask for a break. An example in my work, I was in a workshop that primarily employed individuals with intellectual disabilities. And they had these spools that they were unwinding string for. These spools were used, the twine on them was used to suspend tomatoes in a greenhouse operation. And before they could reuse the spools, the twine had to come off and the spools had to be sanitized. And so our folks were removing the string from the spools. And I watched as a staff member sat an individual down at a table, a very large table that probably had 300 of these spools sitting on it. And he immediately began self-slapping and self-hitting. The staff person got him up, took him for a little walk, and took him for a drink, which is something that would help him calm. When they came back, I put 3 spools on front of a table, and I asked the staff person to set him there and have him unwind those 3 spools. And he unwound those 3 spools, and I told the staff person, now take him for a little walk and a drink. When he came back, there were 3 more spools. And he did these because it didn't look like it was more than he could do. It wasn't a daunting task. And over time, we slowly increased the number of spools he did without a break until last I heard he was doing 40 or more spools at one sitting. Now, one thing we could have done in that situation too was to teach him a way to ask for a break. And for him, it would have been with sign language because he was entirely nonverbal. Now, in this situation, if you teach people how to ask for a break, you might find that they're asking for a break real frequently. In fact, ask for a break before you even start the task. Well, at that point, it's time to teach the person a little patience, or in my field, we call it tolerance for delay of reinforcement. And there's a chapter in Ted Carr's book that addresses that procedure precisely. But it's sort of like this. The person asks for a break, and in the beginning, you've been honoring the break all along. But then when they ask for a break, you say something or communicate to the person somehow, just one more. And they do that one more, and then they take the break. And over time, you get that up to just 2 more, just 3 more, etc., so that they are spending more time being productive at whatever it is they're doing and less time taking breaks. But this needs to be done slowly and gradually. For most of our folks with DS-ASD, we will see a change in behavior slowly and gradually, and if we try to push it too fast and too hard, we'll often see the problem behavior resurface, and it won't be pretty for anyone involved. Okay, in the next example, a person isn't receiving attention which he likes. He hits another person nearby. A staff person comes over, tells him to stop, and explains why he shouldn't hit. This explanation, and I don't know why, goes on for 5 minutes. Well, in this situation, the person got a payoff or was reinforced for hitting the other person because he got attention for 5 minutes. That is, if the person who hit likes attention. But in this situation, it likes it. It looks like the person likes it because he did it when he wasn't receiving any attention. Okay, so he got lots of attention, probably really rich in tension, you know, scolding or whatever, which I do not recommend, for 5 minutes. So in other words, the next time that he wants attention, he may hit again. So one thing I would like to point out here for you is that if you see someone use problem behavior and you're like, what just happened? What was the trigger? What was the antecedent for this problem behavior? And you just can't determine one. Well, take a look for a couple of things. One is, was that person receiving attention at that time? If they like attention and they've been without attention for 15 minutes or however long they can tolerate, and then they use a problem behavior and they get attention, that behavior was probably used to get attention. Another one is, if you place an expectation upon a person to do a lot of work and they're getting into the work, they've not been using any problem behavior, and then they suddenly start using problem behavior, throwing the work all over the place, yelling and screaming and whatnot, maybe it was time that they wanted a break. They'd had just enough of whatever it was. Okay, so when you don't see a trigger, think about attention or think about a task that the person is in the middle of. There are other situations, but we don't have time to go through all that. Now, in this situation, the person should be taught to ask for attention without hitting. Okay, types of payoffs and reinforcement. As we have seen, there are different types of payoff or reinforcement for the behavior. In the example of the child who bit himself in a crowded and noisy place, he was able to escape an unpleasant environment. Okay? The reasons that people use behavior is called functions in my field. There are 4 main functions. We'll talk about them in a little bit. Escape and avoidance is one function. That's one reason people use problem behavior, is to get away from or avoid something they don't like. In the example of the child who hit her mother, the child was able to get something she wanted. So the first example was able to avoid something unpleasant, here to get something that was preferred or pleasurable. In the example of the person who waved a string in front of his eyes, he was able to get a sensation that he likes, like those of us who like chocolate. We eat it for the sensation. We don't eat it to get praise or to get paid. By the way, if you know of a job where a person gets paid to eat chocolate, please contact me. In the case of the child who banged her head, she was able to escape a task she didn't like. Okay, so we're going to come back and talk about this later when we talk about replacement behaviors. In the examples of the person who hit another person, he was able to get attention. So here are the 4 reasons people use to get behavior, and we call them in my field functions. First function is to get attention. Next one is to get something. Next one is to escape or avoid something unpleasant. And the next one is to get pleasant situations. And actually, I should be honest with you, some behaviors are used to avoid unpleasant situations. think about this. Have you ever had a headache and have rubbed your temples or your head in an attempt to at least escape part of the headache? Okay, that's a self-stimulatory behavior, but really what you're doing is trying to avoid stimulation you don't like. Now, a warning. Attention can be such a strong payoff for reinforcer that often you get what you attend to. In other words, you get what you pay attention to. For those individuals who like attention, if you pay more attention to their problem behavior than you do to their good behavior, it's very likely you're going to get problem behavior because they like attention. And I've learned, you know, if I reach out and smack my friend, gosh, I'm going to get attention. We've just set them up to use problem behavior in a way that we don't want them to get attention. So the key here is to pay a lot more attention to good behavior than problem behavior. Think back about that 10-to-1 ratio between positive interactions and negative interactions, okay? If you praise someone or interact with them kindly in 10 different situations, and then there's one situation where you have to talk to them about what it was they did wrong, they're learning that it's a much more reliable way to get your attention is by doing good things using good behavior. So again, pay a lot more attention to the good behavior than the problem behavior. This one is really, really key. Don't let problem behavior pay off. The single most effective way to get rid of a problem behavior is to arrange things so that there is no payoff or reinforcement for the behavior. If a person has used problem behavior to get attention, and you decide, okay, I'm not going to give attention when the problem behavior is occurring, if you do that long enough, that's just going to be too much work to do in order to try to get attention. It will finally go away. But this procedure, which we call extinction, can be very difficult in some situations. There's some problem behaviors that, let's say they're being used for attention, that will require at least a little attention. If one person is beating on another, we're going to have to go in and help protect the other person, help keep everyone safe. Now, when you do this, you're going to come into proximity with the person who is doing the hitting. That's a form of attention. You may actually have to put hands on and go into a physical intervention. Okay, touch is a form of attention. But if you go into that situation and you have to do those things, give no more attention than is absolutely necessary. If possible, go into the situation, split the two people apart, and give all of your attention to the victim. And if you feel safe in the situation, have your back toward the aggressor. Now, that's not always safe. I understand it. I've been in those situations. So there are times when it's really difficult to not let problem behavior pay off. And another reason is none of us are perfect. We all will make mistakes. We cannot be 100% consistent. And so we might make a mistake and allow a problem behavior to pay off. So withholding reinforcement, or this procedure that I said was extinction, from a previously reinforced behavior is called extinction. We're not going to let it pay off anymore. That's our plan. You will see an increase in the behavior when you first withhold reinforcement. This is called an extinction burst. Consider the child that I talked about a little bit ago who self-bit to escape a crowded and noisy environment. Let's say This has been successful for him several times. Several times he's been in a crowded and noisy environment. He's bit himself, and someone, dad or whoever, has removed him from the situation. What is likely to happen if someone ignores him when he self-bites? The most likely thing is he's going to try harder. He's going to bite himself harder. He may throw in other behaviors, screaming, kicking, whatever. He's going to escalate because he's thinking something like, well, biting used to work. What am I doing wrong? Maybe it needs to be harder. Maybe it needs to be longer. So you will see an increase in that behavior before it starts to taper off. And by the way, I've talked a little bit here about ignoring a behavior. Planned ignoring only works if it is your attention that the person wants to get. Think about the class clown. Teachers have tried ignoring class clowns, and the class clown is still clownish. Why? It's not the teacher's attention he wants. It's the other students. Okay? If you are consistent in not providing reinforcement when you're withholding it, the behavior will finally decrease. Consider the child who hit her mother to get the potato chips. If the mother decides to quit giving the child what she wants when the child hits her, after the extinction burst, the child would begin to hit less and less to get things. Because again, think about all the work that goes into hitting, all the work that goes into any behavior. If you expend all that work and you never get anything from it, why continue to do that work? Why continue to hit? Why continue to self-bite? Why continue to use any problem behavior if there is no payoff for you? How can we use this information about extinction bursts? Well, when we're in an extinction burst, we can comfort ourselves with the knowledge that the behavior will decrease if we stick to our guns and don't allow the behavior to have a payoff. Again, in other words, we need to be consistent in not allowing the problem behavior to pay off. Again, we're not 100% consistent. If you find yourself being inconsistent in one of these situations, don't beat yourself up and say, I'm a worthless parent, I'm a worthless teacher, I'm a worthless staff member, I'm a worthless whoever. No, 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 no. Thinking that stuff is going to be very counterproductive. Only thing to do is look at the situation, determine why it was that you were inconsistent, and make a plan for not being inconsistent or for being consistent the next time. And if that plan doesn't work out and you are inconsistent again, then sit down and figure out a new plan or modify the first one. Just keep working to get it better. Don't beat yourself up. It's no good. It's not helpful. Now, intermittent reinforcement. Intermittent reinforcement is when the behavior pays off only some of the time. Intermittent reinforcement, meaning the behavior only works some of the time for the person, only pays off some of the time, makes the behavior more durable or longer lasting without reinforcement. So, now to my story. In this story, and not a real story, but in this story I have a blender that is 8 years old. It was the bottom of the line blender in the store. It was the cheapest one I could find. I've been using it for 8 years every morning to make myself a fruit smoothie. So one morning I get up, I put the chunks of fruit into the blender, I put in some fruit juice, and now we look at the behavior that we're going to examine in this example, and that behavior is pushing the button to make the blender go, to make it zizz everything up. And this morning I push the button and it doesn't zizz. The blender doesn't work. I look, it's plugged in, I go, huh. So I push the button, again it doesn't go. Now I push the button hard. Oh, I push the button hard. Look at that, an extinction burst. I'm trying harder. Okay, I push the button hard, and on that third push, the blender works and it blends everything up for me, and I have my fruit smoothie. Hooray. And I'm wondering what happened. Well, the next morning I get up, I put everything in the blender, I push the button, and it doesn't work. In fact, I have to push that button 8 times before it works. I'm pushing the button hard. I'm smacking the side of the blender. Oh yeah, there we are with the extinction burst, right? Finally, though, on the 8th push, it works for me. Next morning, I have to push that button 16 times. I'm thinking, maybe I need a new blender. But on the 16th push, it blends everything up. I have my smoothie, and I'm going to pick up a blender, but the day is busy and I forget. I don't get one. Next morning, I get up and I go, oh no. I put everything in and I push the button, and on the first push, it works. I'm like, oh my gosh, this thing, maybe it heals itself. Yeah, right. Yeah, it didn't heal itself. Next morning, I push that button 23 times before it goes, and I am going to get a new blender. But again, the day is busy and I forget. Next morning, I get up, I push the button 5 times, and it works. So I'm like, what is up with this crazy, crazy blender? Next morning, I get up, put everything in it. I push that button 42 times before I finally give up. Pour everything out of the blender, and that day I do get a new blender. But let's look at this story. If on the first day that the blender began to fail, if I would have had to have pushed that button 42 times to get it to work, I wouldn't have. I would have given up much earlier, thinking the thing was broken. But no, this simple little mindless machine had taught me to think, maybe this time, maybe this time, maybe this time, and it had done it on an unpredictable schedule. I mean, once I pushed the button, what was it, 23 times? The next day it was on the first time. Sometimes it was the 5th time, the 3rd time, whatever. I never knew when it was going to happen, so I was thinking, maybe this time, maybe this time. And so that made that behavior be much more durable, much longer lasting without a payoff. And I don't know about Minnesota, but in Colorado, there's an industry that makes a lot of money from intermittent reinforcement. It's those casinos up in our mountains. You know, those slot machines don't pay off every time. They can't. Casino wouldn't stay in business. But they know, in fact, I'm sure they're tracking the gamblers' behaviors with a computer to determine just how often and how much to pay off to keep the people standing at those machines and putting more money in, and the casino hopes lose more money than they win, at least for most of the people. So intermittent reinforcement will make a behavior more durable or longer lasting. So how can we use this information? We can use it to motivate us to be consistent and not give in occasionally. I've actually had parents tell me something like, I don't know why he continues to do it. You know, I only give in every 5th or 6th time. And I'm like, oh, no, no. Let's talk about intermittent reinforcement. That's why he continues to use it. Now let's back up and talk about an extinction burst. An extinction burst is the wrong time to reinforce or to provide a payoff for someone. If we give in during an extinction burst, we've taught the individual 2 things. Okay? They are, first, we have taught the individual to escalate if she or he doesn't get their way. Well, that's not something that we want to teach. We don't want them to teach them to use more extreme problem behavior. And another is we've taught this individual to keep trying because the behavior works sometimes. This is because we've used intermittent reinforcement. How do we use intermittent reinforcement? Well, let's say we have, well, here. Let me give you an example. I was working in a hospital in an outpatient setting with a speech-language pathologist, who I will call an SLP, and an occupationalist, who I will call an OT. And they were working to increase this young man's number of foods that he would eat. He had 5 or 6 foods that he would eat and absolutely nothing else. And of course, the foods that he ate were not very nutritious. I think one of his preferred foods was potato chips. Well, this is not good for his health. So they asked me to come in because they were having very little luck. We worked up a system. They had most of the system together. They were pretty bright people. And the system that we came up with was that we had 32 little, those pill cups they have in hospitals. They give you the pills in and you swallow them. Had 32 of those with a little slice of a carrot in some of those, and a little bit of another non-preferred, and some with preferred foods, etc. in them. And he had to taste 26 of those. He had to take those, bite them, and swallow them down. And if he did 26 out of the 32, then he got a little Hot Wheels car that he could play with. And he liked those sorts of things. Well, we got to the end of the session, and he'd only tried, I think, 22. Session was over. He got up, and we went over to get the little Hot Wheels car. Well, the SLP told him no, he hadn't earned it, at which point he began to yell and scream and carry on and go into what some people call a tantrum. And during this time, he went from yelling and screaming down to the floor, kicking, thrashing about. At one point, he picked up a small chair, hit it against the wall, and at that point, I asked the SLP, "Hey, will the hospital mind if there's a hole in the wall?" And she said, "I don't think so." I said, "Okay." Well, when he first started going into this extinction burst, which is what this was, I huddled up with the SLP and the OT, and I said, "Okay, I don't know how long this is going to last, but if we don't give him that car, it will finally end. Okay? If he does something dangerous, we'll have to keep him safe, and I'll look after that. In the meantime, let's not give him any attention either, because he might find that reinforcing." So the OT then went out into the hall and sat with the mother, which was a good thing because the mother was so embarrassed she was about to come in and take the boy home. And the OT told her, "No, this is a learning experience for him. Please leave him be." And so he, like I said, he yelled, he kicked, he laid on the floor, he threw a chair against the wall. He did a number of things. And then he, my point here with the intermittent reinforcement is if he'd used several of these behaviors and then we'd given in during the extinction burst, we essentially had told him no, 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 no several times, and then we would have essentially said, "Yes, here's the little car." So we would have taught him both to escalate his behavior and to keep on trying because it worked part of the time. By the way, he finally did give up and quit because it was just too much work. And he went on for about 15 minutes. Now, one thing you should know about an extinction burst, and this boy displayed this, was that he escalated, and if you graphed it on a chart, imagine it in your mind's eye, he got up to the top, and he was starting to get tired, and so he started to decrease his behavior a little, and then he thought, "Oh, no, I can't give up now," so he increased behavior some, and then it started to decrease again, and once again he thought, "I can't give up," and the behavior began to increase again some, but the trend there was for a decrease. We saw all these little hiccups along the way, but the trend was for the decrease in problem behavior. Next time he came back, he tasted all the little piece of carrots, etc., that he needed to in order to earn his little car. And the next time when he didn't, his extinction burst with us lasted for about 30 seconds, and it wasn't nearly as intense. And by the way, the OT asked the mother out in the hall that first time what she would have done if the boy had done this at home, and the mother said, oh, I would have given him the car. Well, that's where he learned that this problem behavior paid off. So, we don't give in during extinction bursts, and we don't give in only some of the time. Okay, building skills. Why build skills? If problem behavior is the result of a skill deficit, we need to teach the individual a skill or skills that will allow him or her to achieve their goals without problem behavior. By the way, there are procedures for getting rid of problem behavior. Some are ethical, some are not, some are legal, some are not. I like to stay legal, I like to stay ethical, but let's say all we did was use punishment to get rid of the problem behavior. Well, and that's not what I would do, not at all. But if we did that, let's think about this person's behavioral repertoire, a person with DS-ASD. Behavioral repertoire is every skill and every behavior that a person knows how to use. We have very, very large behavioral repertoires. There are lots and lots of things we know how to do. Many of us have vocabularies that are in the thousands of words, 10,000 words probably, but people with DS-ASD have a much smaller behavioral repertoire. Well, if all we did was punish out the problem behaviors, that person would be left in what is referred to sometimes as a behavioral vacuum. We don't want to leave them with very few behaviors. They already have very few behaviors. We want to teach them new skills, many of them, and some of them, to replace their problem behaviors. So that's what we do through teaching problem behaviors. Often, the function or the purpose of a behavior is appropriate, but the way that the individual goes about achieving the function or the purpose of the behavior is not. For example, an individual might throw things in order to get attention. You know, it's appropriate to ask for attention in most situations, but it is not appropriate to ask for attention by throwing things. In this case, we could teach the person to ask for attention by tapping someone on the shoulder. That's a handy way to teach someone to ask for attention if that person is nonverbal or has very limited communication skills. If they have communication skills, we could teach them other ways to ask for attention by saying, "May I talk to you, please?" or whatever we choose. So the purpose for the behavior is not inappropriate. It's appropriate. The way the person went about it by throwing things was inappropriate. By the way, teaching replacement behaviors is what we are trying to do when we ask, what could you have done instead? But this question, although it's a very good question at times, really we need to be teaching the people what they could do ahead of time. Okay, so we can tell the person, if you want attention, here's what you want, and we go through the whole teaching procedure, which, by the way, is in Ted Carr's book, again, to teach them to tap on the shoulder to get attention. Now, if we're going to look for another behavior to replace a problem behavior, they have to save the same purpose or have the same function. And they are said to be, if they do, they're said to be functionally equivalent. Functional equivalence means that the replacement behavior produces the same effect for the individual, or very nearly the same effect for the individual as the problem behavior did. For example, tapping a person on the shoulder could be functionally equivalent to throwing things. Okay? But there's some things we have to do to help encourage the person to tap on the shoulder and not throw things or use other problem behavior. We have to have a behavior that is more efficient. To be more efficient, the behavior has to be easier. Okay? For example, tapping someone on the shoulder has to be easier than throwing things or hitting someone or whatever. It's easier. And you know, we are all out. We are all looking for the easiest way to accomplish our goals. Okay? Now, our goals might take a whole lot of work. Say, my preparation for this webinar. It was not easy, but I certainly was looking for the easier way to do it rather than the harder way. And the behavior must be at least as reliable, at least, and really more reliable in paying off. So, in the beginning, if throwing something was able to get the person attention every time, when we teach them to tap on the shoulder to get attention, at least in the very beginning, we have to give them attention every time. If we don't give them attention, they know exactly how to get attention. They go throw something again. So we need the replacement behavior to be easier and at least as reliable in payoff. In addition, do not allow the problem behavior to continue to be effective for the individual. This is what we talked about when we talked about extinction. Okay? So, we've taught them that tapping on the shoulder gets them attention. In the meantime, we're ignoring the throwing of objects to get attention. Unless there's some sort of safety concern, then we step in, do what we need to keep everyone safe, while giving as little attention to the person as possible. So now we have an easier behavior that's paying off at least as often, and the problem behavior isn't paying off anymore. Well, there's a real lesson there. Let's start tapping the person on the shoulder instead of throwing things to get attention. We teach the replacement behavior each time that the trigger for the problem behavior occurs. Okay? Let me give you two examples here. At one time, well, my wife and I have 4 sons. They're all grown out of the home now, but at one time they were all at home. And for a while we had a van, and raising 4 sons, we didn't have lots of extra money, so it was an older van, and the doors on the van required slamming in order to get them to shut. I don't know if any of you have owned a vehicle like that, but we did. And then we got a new vehicle, and of course I didn't want the doors to be slammed on this new vehicle. And so we'd pull into the driveway, we'd get out, and the boys would slam their doors. It was out of the force of habit. I'd say, boys, please, don't slam the doors. Oh, okay, Dad. Well, we did that about 3 times, and each time they slammed the doors, they'd forgotten. Well, I was like, okay. Use what you know, Sam. So, as we were pulling up to a stop, I would then teach the replacement behavior and I'd say, remember, boys, close the doors gently. Don't slam them. And the boys got out, and they would close the doors gently. We did that a few times. They got into the habit. So I was teaching them the replacement behavior, actually not at the trigger, but just before the trigger. Another example is, let's take the example of the individual who bit himself to escape a crowded and noisy place. When the father saw his son first beginning to show signs of distress, and many of our folks with DS-ASD will have behaviors that show they're becoming distressed, his father could have said something like, say leave please, or sign leave please, or whatever. We're teaching him at that moment. And this, as I said before, will often work well if it is practiced in less demanding situations. Okay. Again, I need to come back to this book, the one that much of this material is covered in this book and in more depth. Here's the name of the book, and the interventions are in chapters 8 through 14. Sorry, I told you 8 through 13 before. And again, it's research-based and layperson-friendly. That's there in your handouts. I highly, highly recommend it. Okay, Social stories. Social stories are another great way to build skills. Social stories help prepare a person for a social situation by helping them to know what is going to be occurring in the situation. You know, a lot of our folks with DS-ASD and folks with just autism and other folks with just Down syndrome or other intellectual disabilities get a little nervous if they don't know what's going to be happening. They don't like surprises. They want things to be predictable. And my guess is this, and I can't climb inside the head of a person with a disability or a person without a disability to know what's going on. But my guess is this, there's so much confusion in their life, there's so much that they don't understand, that they like for things to be predictable, because if they're predictable, then they understand what's going on in their lives, which is a good reason to introduce routine into their lives. And although I don't have time to talk about that really, I need to also inform you that we can get people to be routine bound. Too much routine, and there are ways to deal with that, but I don't have time for that. So we'll use a social story to let them know what is going to be occurring in the upcoming situation. And we can use it to tell them what other people might be thinking, feeling, believing, so that they'll understand why other people react. By the way, people with DS-ASD very, very typically have difficulty reading other people and knowing why the other person is reacting or responding the way that they are. Sometimes it just looks like they're completely blind in this regard. They have great difficulty taking someone else's perspective. And by the way, as we'll see after a little bit, social stories are a very good avenue, a very good way to teach people perspective-taking skills, which is a prerequisite for teaching empathy. Perspective-taking is perhaps the most important of all social skills. All of us have perspective-taking skills to one degree or another. None of us can really read someone else's mind and know for sure what's going on with them, but we can read different hints, body language, facial expressions, tone of voice, etc., to help us to understand why the person is reacting the way they are, and so that we can alter our interaction to help them feel more comfortable or to clear up confusion or whatever. Many of our people have a great deal of difficulty doing that, and you can imagine the difficulty that gives them with social skills. And in a social story, we can give them options for responding, meaning we'll give them other ways to respond other than problem behavior. And we're always looking for them. We're going to give them a roadmap of possible ways to respond in this situation. Here's an example. Well, before I give you this, I should tell you, I'm going to show you a social story. I wrote this for a young man who I knew well. I had well-developed rapport with him. I had worked with him at an exceptional camp that's held in the mountains here in Colorado, and his parents hired me to come to them on the island of Nantucket in Massachusetts, or off the coast of Massachusetts, to work with the people at school who were having great difficulty with this young man who was 10 or 11 at the time. Well, I went back there. I had a great relationship with him, as I said, and the parents had a small apartment in their basement. That's where I stayed. I took my meals with him. I played with him and his brother and sister, and we got to know each other even better. But the time came that I had to go to the school. And my first job at the school was to observe. Well, this boy had Fragile X and very, very likely had autism too. I know this, he had a great deal of anxiety, and if I had shown up in the school out of context, it would probably have given him anxiety, and using the vernacular, thrown him for a loop, and I wouldn't have seen the behaviors that were typical. Now, I know as a behavior analyst that when I observe, I'm going to change the person's behavior somewhat, but I didn't want to change them any more than was necessary, so I wrote the story for him. I'm going to read through this story once. Then I will explain the guidelines for social stories. And these guidelines come from Carol Gray, an incredible person who developed social stories. And then we will read the story again to see how those guidelines were implemented. By the way, when she developed this, there was no research or scant pieces of evidence that these would be effective. But since that time, research has shown that they are very effective when done right, when following her guidelines. And they're not only effective for people with DS-ASD, but with people with all sorts of disabilities. And I've had lots of parents tell me that they work well for the kids without disabilities too. So here is the story. Sam. Sam is coming to my school, and that is okay. Sometimes Sam will be in my classroom. Sometimes Sam might go to other classes, and that is okay. Sam will be working while he is at my school. Sometimes he might be typing on his computer. Sometimes he might just watch what other people are doing. Please note, I didn't tell him that I would be watching him. Sam will be busy and won't want to be bothered. When Sam is in school, I can try to work just like I do on the other days. Sam will like that because he knows that working at school is good for me. Okay. I think, I'm sorry, I'm having problems here. Okay, now, sorry for this. Next, when Sam is at my school, I can try not to bother him. Sam will like that because then he can do his work. I might even try to pretend that Sam isn't there. Sam will like that because he doesn't want to bother me either. Now, Carol Gray says that social stories should be followed by questions and or role play. The questions I wrote for this story were, who will be coming to school? And you'll notice I'm hitting the most important parts of the story. Will Sam be busy? What are some things that Sam might do? I'm giving him the lay of the land now. I'm letting him know what I'm doing so it's not surprising and it doesn't throw him for a loop. Will Sam want me to bother him? What can I try to do when Sam is at school? Okay, let's go to the guidelines for the social stories. As I said, Carol Gray developed social stories and the guidelines. And these guidelines have been put to the test of research. And because of that, I recommend following her guidelines when writing social stories. Her book, the new social story book, illustrated edition, provides many examples of social stories and also provides the guidelines in the back of the book. I must say that I've seen a number of social stories written that apparently the people either didn't know the guidelines or weren't implementing them, and they did not work nearly as well. Now, this book and her other books provide examples of social stories, and they're great examples of social stories. However, I've not found one yet to fit a specific situation that I was working in. So I've written all of my social stories, but if you get this book, you might find that none of them fit a situation for you, or you might. But the great use for those social stories is to look at them for examples of how social stories are written. So let's take a look at these social stories. Her guidelines primarily concern the types of sentences, and we'll see that there are 4 types that are used primarily, and the ratio between these different types of sentences. Okay, there are several types of sentences, but the 4 most common that I use are descriptive sentences. We'll talk about them in a little bit. Perspective sentences, we'll talk about those too. Directive sentences, we'll talk about them. And affirmative sentences, which we will cover too. Carol recommends at least a 2-to-1 ratio between the total of non-directive sentences and the total of directive sentences. Now, the non-directive sentences then are the descriptive sentences, the perspective sentences, and the affirmative sentences. So you're going to need to have at least twice as many of those sentences all put together as there are directive sentences. And the reason for that is that these other types of sentences, the descriptive sentences, perspective sentences, and affirmative, help the individual that the story is written for to understand the situation they're in and how people might respond and how they can respond. It's giving them the lay of the land. It's helping set them up for success. I have seen social stories that were written with only directive sentences, and those social stories did not give the how or the why of the directive sentences. Like one went something like, when I go up to school, I will hang up my coat in the hallway. When I come in, I will hang up my backpack on the hook that is mine. Then I will sit down at my desk. Then I will get out. And it was just one thing after another after another. There wasn't a sentence in there that explained why or how. And just like us, our folks with DS-ASD should know why. It helps them to understand. It helps them to generalize the behaviors into new situations too. Okay. Carol also recommends comprehension questions and/or role play after the story. Let me tell you, role play can be so important. That is where the individual has an opportunity to practice the skills. So let's say we're in a situation with the boy who bit himself to get out of the crowded and noisy place. The first step in that might be to write a social story about we're going to go to an assembly. In this assembly, there will be lots of other people. There will be someone who talks to everyone. That person will be describing to us whatever, how basketball is played or something of that nature. Sometimes it might get loud in there, and it might get crowded. It might get more louder and crowded than I want. If it does, I can say to my teacher, I want to leave. And my teacher will take me out. Okay, so we've given the reasons, we've set out the lay of the land in that situation, and now we will have them role play in a situation where there might not be any loudness or a crowd, and then we'll role play where there are a few people and there's some noise but not a lot, and then we'll go on into louder and more crowded situations until the person can handle the full throes of an assembly in the gymnasium. Okay, descriptive sentences. They're statements of fact that are free of opinions and assumptions. They just state what is. An example from that story we saw was, sometimes Sam will be in my classroom. That's just telling my little guy what's going to happen. It's a statement of fact. No opinion, no assumption in there. Descriptive sentences are great for giving the individual the lay of the land in social situations. It helps them to understand what's going to go on. Again, a descriptive sentence gives an individual the lay of the land in social situations. And I've actually written at least one social story that had nothing but descriptive sentences in it. It was for a young boy with autism. He was transitioning from preschool to kindergarten, and it was going to be a brand new situation, new school, new teacher, and many of the students were going to be new too. And working with his mother, we wrote a social story that described to him everything to expect when he got to his new room and classroom, and let him know that some of his friends would be there, whose teacher's name was, etc. And it was all descriptive. And descriptive sentences, according to Carol Gray, are the only type of sentence that is required in a social story. Perspective sentences. Perspective sentences tell about another person's perspective, like their thoughts, feelings, beliefs, opinions, and motivation. Again, a lot of our folks with DS-ASD have great difficulty determining that. And so, an example of a perspective sentence is, Sam will like that because then he can do his work. Now, this young man that I wrote this story for, I knew he liked me, and I knew that he wanted to please me. We had well-built rapport. So I put this in, let him know what my perspective was. Sam will like that because then he can do his work. I didn't say, don't bother Sam. No, I knew with him, just giving him my perspective would work for him. And he was the sort who would not have known that I would have appreciated not being bothered without being told. Again, perspective sentences are great for teaching perspective taking, which is a prerequisite skill for teaching empathy. Directive sentences. These are where we tell the person what they can do. Directive statements are provide the individuals with an option or options of how to respond in a situation. Because these are truly options, the sentences often include phrases like, I can try to, or I might. An example of a directive sentence from the story is, when Sam is at my school, I can try not to bother him. Now here's the reason we just don't lay it down and say, I will not bother him. Instead, we can say things like, I can try to, or I might. And that is, a lot of folks with DS-ASD can become very, very rigid, routine-bound, as I've mentioned some before. And if we tell them, okay, I will not bother him, or whatever other directive sentence, we might come to a situation where it's all right to bother me, or to use some sort of other response. We don't want to lock them into that particular response all the time. So it's like a suggestion. I can try to, or I might. Affirmative sentences affirm commonly held values or opinions, and they can also provide reassurance. One example of an affirmative sentence is, that is okay. Sam will be in my classroom, or is coming to my school, and that is okay. That's reassurance, letting him know things are fine. Another example is, staying in my seat on the school bus is a good idea. That's a commonly held value or opinion in our culture. So, affirmative sentences really serve two purposes: provide reassurance, or let them know what most people think is a good thing. Another guideline, this one is very important, for writing social stories is that it be written in the language that the individual will understand. If they don't understand it, then we might as well not write it. In order to write stories for individuals with DS-ASD, we're going to have to keep the sentences shorter, because the longer a sentence is, the more grammatically complex it is, and the more difficult it will be for our folks to understand the sentence. and we need to use vocabulary that they will understand. If there are unknown words in there, they aren't going to get it all. Now, that's not to say we shouldn't teach folks with DS-ASD new words. We should, but it's usually not the venue of a social story. So let's take a look at my social story again and see how those principles were applied in this story. Sam is coming to my school, and that is okay. Now, this first sentence is a compound sentence, two sentences put together with a comma and an and. Sam is coming to my school. That is a descriptive sentence, giving him the lay of the land. And that is okay is an affirmative sentence, and that is giving him reassurance. Sometimes Sam will be in my classroom. Okay, another descriptive sentence. Sometimes Sam might go to other classes. Descriptive, and then the compound part there, and that is okay, again, reassurance. Sam will be working while he's typing, while he is at my school. Sorry. That is a descriptive sentence. Sometimes he might be typing on his computer. Now, let's take a look at these so far. Remember, the total of the non-directive sentences, which is affirmative, perspective, and descriptive, there have to be at least twice as many of them as there are directive sentences. Well, we have 5 sentences here, and we've yet to give a directive sentence. We're giving the lay of the land, and we're helping this young man to understand the why, or we will very soon. Sometimes he might just watch what other people are doing. Another descriptive sentence. Sam will be busy and won't want to be bothered. Okay, Sam will be busy is descriptive, but the second half is perspective. He won't want to be bothered. When Sam is in the school, I will try to work just like I do on other days. Our very first directive sentence. Directive sentence. Sam will like that because he knows that working at school is good for me. Okay, that's a perspective sentence, how I feel, and it also throws in a little sales pitch for school, because working at school is good. When Sam is at my school, I will try not to bother him. There's another directive sentence. I will try. Again, I'm not telling him not to bother me. I'm just saying I will try not to bother him. By the way, you may have noticed these stories are written in the first person of the listener, the person it's written for. Sam will like that because then he can do his work. There, another perspective sentence, letting him know why not to bother me. I might even try to pretend that Sam isn't there. Again, another directive sentence. Sam will like that because he doesn't want to bother me either. Another perspective sentence. So I'm not sure how many sentences there were altogether, but only 3 of them were directive. The rest was used to fill in the how and the why. Comprehension questions? Ask them again. Okay, I have some other good things for you to read, and they're in your handouts. Visual Strategies for Improving Communication, Practical Supports for Autism Spectrum Disorders by Linda Hodgson. It says for autism spectrum disorders, but let me tell you, it's good not only for people with ASD, but people with DS-ASD, with people with Down syndrome, with people with all sorts of disabilities. It is a great book for learning how to develop visual schedules and for many other ways of using visual supports for communication. Many of our people with DS-ASD and people with ASD, well, and people with Down syndrome, are much more visual learners or responders. Visual forms of communication seem to work better for them than do the auditory. Not for everyone, but for many of them. And so we will use things like visual schedules, and I'm sure some of you know what I'm talking about. It could be a series of pictures that show what's going to happen in any given situation. You know, There could be one in the home for when I get up. I show a picture of getting up, picture of taking off the pajamas, picture of putting on clothes. In fact, it might show putting on the clothes, putting on the shirt first, the underwear next, the pants next, etc. And then show the bathroom, then show brushing of teeth, combing of hair, etc. Visual schedules really help a person with disabilities, or at least many people with disabilities, to remember how things are going, or to keep them from being surprised by something that is going to be coming up later in the day. And they can be very handy for use when a routine is going to be disrupted, such as in a group home. Let's say the routine most days is after supper, we'll watch TV, or someone will read books to us, or whatever. But on Friday nights, we're all going into the community. On that day, there's a picture that shows what's going to be going on in the community. And hopefully, it's more than just Friday nights. And hopefully, it's more than just nights, too. But if there's a disruption of routine, a visual schedule can really help iron that out. Because, again, many of our people can become routine-bound and very rigid. The book that was mentioned earlier, When Down Syndrome and Autism Intersect, it was edited by Margaret Fralke and Robin Zaborek. It was the first book written about the population of people who have both Down syndrome and autism. And to my knowledge, and I could easily be wrong on this, it's still the only one. Now, there may be other books, I could be wrong, but it was the first one, to the best of my knowledge. Now, it has a lot of good information concerning people with DS-ASD. My chapter about problem behavior in those with DS-ASD is in this book and contains more information than this webinar did. But my chapter is not the only one. There are many chapters that deal with things like programming for education in schools, etc. It's a great book. Maybe I'm a little biased, but I think it has a lot of great information in it. This one is an article. It's actually an article with 3 case studies following it, using functional assessment to develop effective individualized interventions for challenging behaviors. I have down when it was published, what it was published in, its page numbers, its volume number, and its issue number. So if any of you wish, you can look it up. You may have to go to some place like the University of Minnesota or some library that has a good number of holdings to either get that or to get a Xerox copy of it. The first article covers the assessment of behavior, and then the next 3 are about case studies about providing support to those with problem behavior. It is very, very content rich. There's a lot in that book, an awful lot. Okay, now I've come to the end, and I am very glad that we now have time for questions. Let's open it up for questions. Is anyone there?
Yes. Kathleen, are you going to start the questions, or is Catherine still on? If so, we can't hear you. Oh, Catherine says her audio is not working. Okay.
Okay.
Would you like me to start?
Sure, sure.
Okay.
Oh, there she is. Yes, go ahead.
Sorry about that. Okay, so our first question is from early on in the webinar. The question is, my daughter, age 4, often hits when she doesn't want to do something, usually going to the bathroom. She's getting all my attention in the bathroom, so she's not hitting for attention. How do I encourage a bathroom stop without hitting? She gets a little candy whenever she goes to the potty on her own, so she knows there is a reward for going to the potty.
Okay. Now, several things there. One, it still might be for attention, or at least partially, because of all the rich attention that she gets in there. I would examine the situation that happens right when you ask her to do that. One thing that might be is that it is coming out of the blue, and I'm sorry that I can't visit with you right now, but maybe she knows she has to do this occasionally, but maybe she is in the middle of a preferred activity, doesn't want to give it up, or it's just coming as a surprise to her. If that is the case, then use a visual schedule and say things like, when using the visual schedule, okay, we're doing this. Remember, in 5 minutes, we're going to go to the bathroom. Then again, at 1 minute before, you can say, in 1 minute, we're going to the bathroom. And you might even have a timer count down to that 1 minute. Another thing to do is to look for anything that might be aversive for her. Does she not like the sound of the toilet flushing? I've run into quite a number of individuals where the toilet flush is really loud. Are the lights too bright? Is there anything in the situation that might be bothering her that would make her reluctant to go in there? And then another one to look at is the reinforcer that you're offering. Candy. Okay, I don't have a problem with candy being offered if it's not offered too often, you know, because there are health concerns with that. But is the candy a strong enough motivator or reinforcer? Or is there something else? Could you build a game around this so it would be more fun? Could you put up a chart and chart her successes, etc.? One thing I would say is ignore the hitting to the degree possible. If she's young, it may hurt, but it's hopefully won't leave bruises or break bones or anything like that. So give no attention to hitting, at least to the degree possible. Okay, those are the ideas that I've come up with, the few details I have. Another question.
So there's two questions here that kind of cover the same behavior, so I'm gonna read the one that has more details. My son likes to do dishes and play with the water and makes a mess. He gets up early in the morning and spends a lot of time there before we, when we try to move him away, he throws himself on the floor. So the related question is what to do about drop and flop.
Okay, drop and flop. What we need to do in this situation, well, there are a number of things to do, but you can use this anytime you're taking someone away from a preferred activity or situation. Again, a visual schedule would be real good. You could come out, he's been playing, having a great time in the water, and you show him the schedule that shows that when a certain amount of time is up, and again, you can use a timer or whatever, warn him this will be up in 5 minutes, in 1 minute, and then in 5 seconds. But make the next thing on his visual schedule something that he prefers, something that he enjoys, so he isn't being dragged away from a highly preferred activity to a humdrum or non-preferred activity. And that should help him to move on. One thing for sure that you don't want to do is allow him to get back to that water, because the dropping and flopping then will have worked for him. And also, if you have time in your schedule, and if you don't, I recommend you build it into it, leave enough time for him to just drop and flop on the floor, and he'll finally, I don't know how long it will take, but he'll finally quit, because that's just too much effort to get back to the water. So again, have a preferred activity be the very next activity, and don't allow him back to the water, and allow him to flop on the floor as long as he wants, as long as he's not hurting himself. If he gets into a situation where he might be hurting himself, like banging his head on the floor or on a cabinet or something of that nature, put something soft between his head and whatever object is banging, and if necessary, put your hand in there. I know it will hurt. I've done this numerous times, but it's better that my hand get hurt than the individual get a concussion from it. Okay? Now, before I ask for the next question, I should tell you all, I know many of you will be done. This is scheduled to be done by 3 o'clock your time, but I'm willing to stay on and ask more questions afterwards. So those of you who have more time, feel free to stick around. Okay, next question.
So the example this family gives is that we have to take business phone calls at home, or visitor comes to the door, and their 3-year-old child with Down syndrome starts being loud and naughty to get their attention. Typically, wife will try to distract him until I'm done, and will give him attention. What should we be doing?
Okay, if you know the person is coming or calling, and often we don't, get the child into another room and engage in a preferable activity. If you don't know ahead of time, then if it's a phone call, take the phone call in another room while hopefully the other adult in the family is able to take care of the child. And a 3-year-old with Down syndrome, my guess is there should be someone caring for that child most of the time anyway, but do it in another place in the house with some sort of preferable activity. However, you should not give them that preferred activity right after they've used problem behavior. So let's say someone comes to the door, the child starts using the problem behavior, you escort the child to another room, hopefully that has a couple of doors between you and where the other person is, or between the phone and the child so that less can be heard, and you offer them a preferred activity, but you communicate to them in one way or another. And a 3-year-old child with Down syndrome doesn't have a lot of receptive skills usually, but you communicate to them that once they calm down, they can play with this game or do that activity, have that preferred activity. But you don't want to give it right afterwards, but because guess what? You're reinforcing the problem behavior. So you need to ask them at least to calm down. Again, the preferred thing would be to have the child already in another room, away from the front door, away from the phone, so they don't have to use the problem behavior in the beginning, and you can just have them engaged in a preferred activity. Okay? Oh, and by the way, here another thing too is you could use a social story to explain the situation to the individual. You're going to want a lot of pictures with this social story, and pictures are recommended many times for social stories because they are a visual way of communication. But you could explain, you know, that when dad or mom, whoever, gets a phone call, that we'll be going to another room and we'll be playing or doing some sort of highly preferred activity so that dad doesn't get bothered. And so you could practice that a few times ahead of time just by having, you know, grandma call up, and you've gone through the story, grandma calls, you say, okay, we're going to another room. Or you could have, you know, brother or sister go outside, or a neighbor come and knock at the door, etc., and practice this before it actually happens. Okay, next question.
Can social stories be effectively used in a small group setting, or for more than one person at a time?
Oh, most certainly, most certainly. I have helped teachers write social stories for entire classrooms, without a doubt. They're very good for that. So yeah, feel free. Okay, next question.
Next question. Any books for getting help for siblings that have learned behaviors from their sibling who have learned behaviors from their siblings with Down syndrome?
Well, one, I'm not exactly sure which individual we're talking about. If the book is for the sibling themselves, I don't have a set of books, although I know there are many books that are written for siblings of children with disabilities, because you know, siblings of kids with disabilities will often feel left out because the child with the disability is just so darn high maintenance that the child with the disability gets more attention. So, but I don't know the names of those. Now, for helping, for the parents working with a child who has learned behaviors from the sibling, one thing to do is to make sure that the child with the disability does not see problem behaviors be successful for the child with the disability. Now, that takes a while, of course, but the child without the disability, the sibling, is learning through a process of modeling. And let me explain to you how modeling works. Okay? In a situation, there is an observer. And in this situation, it is the sibling who's going to be the observer. And then there will be a modeler, someone using the behavior. In this situation, it is a child with the disability. Okay, and then there's a parent involved. So, the child with the disability hits mom to get an apple. And mom gives the apple to the child. Well, the sibling sees this and says, oh, that's how this works. Aha. Let me back up a little bit and say, there are certain factors that will increase the likelihood that the observer will imitate or use the behavior of the modeler. One of them is if they see the behavior be successful. Okay? So if you allow the sibling to see the behavior be successful, that child, the sibling, is going to be more likely to use it. Now, other situations is the observer is going to be more likely to imitate or try to use the behavior if the modeler is someone who has high status in their lives. So that means mom and dad don't swear around your children. You have high status. And they will be more likely to imitate the swearing. Okay? And another thing that will increase the likelihood that a behavior will be used when an observer sees a modeler using it is if the modeler is similar to the person in some way. And that goes across race, age, gender, etc., height, all those things. So if we have a child who's observing another child using a problem behavior, and that child is about the same age, the same height, the same gender, etc., the observer is going to be more likely to do it. So the real key here for you is to not allow the problem behavior to be successful for the individual with the disability, and then for the sibling, don't allow that problem behavior to be successful for them, and you might throw in some punishment. My favorite form of punishment is timeout. I never, ever recommend physical punishment, spanking, or anything like that. That carries way too much baggage. But a timeout for using the behavior. So don't let the sibling get a payoff. And if you want, you can include some punishment for the child, such as timeout or the removal of some sort of a privilege. Okay. For those of you are left with us, I'm ready for another question.
My adult son lives in a group home. Occasionally, when I pick him up to go to the airport for a planned trip, he will have a meltdown and sit on the floor for hours, losing out in the trip and the ticket. We let him sit quietly, but he can and had sat for hours. Can we do anything to speed this up? And then there's a follow-up question, a follow-up part of that. He has been excited before the trips. I know it's a change in routine and wondering what comes next.
Yeah, and so there's where the use of a social story and or a visual schedule would be very helpful to let him know that what's going to be happening. You know, again, many of our people are pretty rigid and do not like changes in routine, especially ones that are unannounced and unexplained. So a social story would be real good. And again, a visual schedule. The two of those really, to get creative, could be combined. But point out all the good things that are going to be happening. Like, when we get to the airport, we're going to have a hamburger, or whatever the individual likes, etc. And if this is a real common problem, you might practice at least part of this ahead of time and have a social story set up. Take him to the airport when you're not really going to go anywhere. You haven't bought a ticket, so he flops and drops. There's nothing lost. Okay? Now, you do have to have a ticket past security, etc. But having him go a few times just to the airport and have something really fun happen at the airport before you get into the lines, etc., would be a good thing. And then when you go to the point that you're getting through security, which can be a nightmare for people without disabilities, let alone disabilities, something else fun is happening. Whether it be play a game or eat another hamburger or watch the airplanes through the windows or whatever, do that. And while at the airport, as much as it's possible, you know, help him to avoid situations that he doesn't like, you know, like you might want to sit in a quieter and less crowded area in the waiting area or whatever. And I think there are special lines in some airports for people, at least with physical disabilities, so they can get through more easily. Maybe they would extend that to people with cognitive disabilities too. It'd be a good question to ask a ticketing agent ahead of time as to what can be done. Okay?
Hi, here's another question. Oh,
go ahead. I was just going to say, notice here the theme in some of these questions is you have something fun waiting for the person when they comply with the change in routine, the transition, or whatever. Go ahead.
Next question. We have had no success whatsoever to keep my daughter from chewing her hair. It seems to be very self-reinforcing. Every therapist, from speech therapist to OT, have tried their own versions. The pediatrician tried shock value and told her about hairballs in the stomach. It is socially off-putting. She is now 16. We've kind of given up on this. Any ideas?
Well, it sounds to me like it's very likely that she has sensory processing disorder. If not, she may have anxiety, and she deals with that in another way. Well, one thing, if you suspect a sensory processing disorder, and that's you know, where these odd self-stimulatory behaviors often come from, not always, then it's time to have an evaluation done to determine what sort of things can be done to help her relieve the need for chewing on her hair in public, and that often, and this is in the field of occupational therapy, it's not my field, often they will prescribe a sensory diet, which means the individual engages in this activity and that activity every so often to help decrease the need for these self-stimulatory behaviors. Besides that, I think I'd write a social story too, helping her to understand how this interferes with social relationships, or at least how it makes other people feel. Now, don't beat her over the head with this. Don't make her feel guilty with it. Introduce it kindly and gently, and let her know how it helps other people feel. And then you can give her probably under the guidance of an OT, something else to do when she's in public, maybe a little fidget ball or some sort of other activity that really doesn't make her stand out and separate her from others. And perhaps she will just need a time to go into another room for a little bit, chew her hair for a little bit, and come back out. Okay, I hope that helps. But an OT is probably the best person. Not all OTs know sensory processing disorder well now. More and more are. In fact, the majority know it. But you'll need an OT who knows sensory processing disorder very well.
Great. So I think we have just a couple more questions that we have time for. So,
okay.
And Kathleen's back, but she said go ahead and finish. So here's a good question. These are kind of general questions that might be helpful. How can we work through this in a classroom situation when a student has behavior outbursts of knocking over desks?
Well, if it presents a danger to others, it's time to get everyone else out of the classroom. I know that's very, very disruptive for the learning environment. But in the beginning, when we're working on these behaviors, and hopefully we'll have a great deal of luck in helping to decrease these behaviors, but safety is first, and if desks are being knocked over, we need to get people to safety, and it's usually best to get the kids out of the classroom because that can be really frightening for the other children too. Okay, so now we have to go back and we have to determine the purpose or the function of that behavior in the individual who is knocking over the desks. To do that, we have to go through an assessment procedure, which may very well take a long time. When I assess behavior, it can take from 5 to more than 10 hours to assess the behavior. Part of that is occurring in a structured interview where I ask the people who know the individual well questions like, okay, what one thing would be most likely to cause this problem behavior to occur? Is it more likely to occur at a particular time of day? Less likely to occur at a particular time of day? Is it more likely to occur in the presence of certain individuals? Is it less likely to occur in the presence of certain individuals? On and on and on and on. And then coupled with observations of the individual, and then there are other procedures including a functional analysis in which a behavior analyst such as myself comes in and we manipulate variables in a situation to see if this particular part of the situation, such as someone asking the class to do work, will result in the problem behavior, and if we take that away, it won't. Such as in that book by Ted Carr, one of the examples is there was a young woman who every time that a male teacher came into the room, the PE teacher I think it was, the student would hit another student, and then the classroom teacher and the PE teacher would both go over and reprimand her and give her lots of attention. Well, it didn't take a lot of work to figure out that the function of the behavior, the purpose was to get attention. They wondered why it was when the male showed up, and so what they did was, on one day when he showed up, he would say something like, "Just a second, Susie, I'll be right there," and he would say 3 or 4 words to the teacher and go over and pay attention to Susie. And on those days, the alternating days, Susie didn't use problem behavior. But on the other days, every other day, he would come into the classroom and he would talk to the teacher and not pay attention to Susie. And on those days, Susie aggressed against the other individuals in the situation. So they were able to determine that it was this male teacher's attention that was maintaining the behavior or reinforcing the behavior. And then they went into procedures like teaching her to tolerate a delay of reinforcement or to be patient in getting the male's teacher, etc. That book will be very, very helpful for that situation. And a good behavior analyst will be very good for that situation too. But in all things, safety comes first. It always comes first. We may have to violate some of what we don't want to do, like pay attention to the individual, at least by coming between them and the victim or whatever. But we have to keep safety first. Okay? Next question?
I think we're probably going to...
Oh, I can hardly hear you.
Kathleen, are you there? I think we keep losing her. So we're going to wrap it up, Sam. And but there's more questions, of course, but they're very specific, and we could probably go on for another 2 hours if we did. And I know everyone's wanting to stop down. Kathleen, are you there? I know Kathleen wanted to kind of thank everybody and end the webinar. Are you there?
No, I think I am, but I don't know if you can hear me.
I can barely hear you. Barely.
Are you on a headset or something? Because I think it's just not connecting.
No, we're on a portable microphone, but it's not working.
Yeah, we can't hear you.
Well, one thing I would like to tell you all, including the audience, those who are left listening, I would certainly find it lovely to come to Minnesota and deliver trainings too, or further webinars. I like Minnesota. My wife's family comes from there. I've been there many times. It's a very pleasant place to be, and I would get to see in-laws, which they might not enjoy, but I would. Okay.
All right. So a bunch of, I think she was trying to say that some are asking about PowerPoint slides. The handout, Sam, has all of the information that were on the slides, and
right.
You can download that right here. It's in the handout pane, or you will get it again if you were on this webinar. You got a reminder, and so the reminder actually had the document link. We'll send that again out tomorrow when the recording goes out.
And one thing I would point out to those who didn't have the handouts, there are lots of blanks, and you fill in those blanks with words from the screen in the PowerPoint. So if you want, you can listen to this again when they get the webinar up and published, and you can fill in those blanks on your handouts at that point too.
Wonderful. All right.
Okay.
I think that's it. Thank you so much, Sam. Do you have anything that you would like to end with today, and then we'll let that be the last word.
Okay. One last thing I'd like to end with, and I ended with my chapter in this book, When Down Syndrome and Autism Intersect. I ended it with this. There have been situations I've been in that have gotten really, really hard, very violent, etc. sort of situations, and I've wondered why I'm there. What am I doing here? I could get hurt. I could get hurt badly, and of course I'm trying to protect others, which makes me an even bigger target. But all I have to do in that situation is to remember, you know, this situation's really tough for me, but it's not anywhere near as tough as it is for the person who's using the problem behavior. They're in a really, really hard place, and we need to realize that it's a very hard place for them. So to get myself through those situations, I remind myself why I'm there. I am there to help this individual to have fewer of these really tough situations, help them to build the skills to be able to get along well in their lives, to have better lives. And so I would recommend to you all, when you're in those situations, you wonder, why am I doing this? Just remind yourself why you are there. Okay.